Property Committee to order. Please silence your cell phones and anything else that may make noise. Any public comments? Public comments? Any public comments? If not, we will move on to the approval of the minutes from September 28th and October 26th. What are your wishes?
Move to approve.
It's been moved by Gibbs, second by
Fisher to second.
Any discussion? Discussion. If not, all is in favor of approval of the minutes will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries unanimously. We'll now move on to approval of the 2021 claims and question costs. They were emailed out to us last Thursday, Friday. Any questions or motions? Heavy on the motions.
Fisher to motion to approve the October 2021 claims and question cost.
McEwen second.
Moved by Fisher, seconded by McEwen. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor of approval of the claims and question costs will signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, no. That motion carries. We will then move on to the interdepartmental budget transfers. There were a number of them from emergency management, health, and sheriff.
Okay, I'm just going to go through these super quick, and I have them up on here. Emergency management, this is a expenditure decrease and an expenditure increase within the same apportionment unit or appropriation unit. So it's really just moving it from like an office supply to another professional services. This would not go forward to county board because it's within its own budget. It's not increasing the revenues, and it's not actually moving outside of the apportion or appropriation unit that's in it. So it's strictly moving some supplies within his own operating budget, and it has not changed a tax levy or moved it to any other budget or increased it at any form. But I just want to point that out because sometimes the budget transfers aren't that exciting. They're just moving stuff from office supply to other professional services within their own budget. This is a great example of that. And then the health department, what happens, tonight you're going to approve the county's 2022 budget. The 2022 budget for the county is from January 1st to December 31st. Within that are grants. Some of the grants come from the federal government. Those grants, the federal government's fiscal year is October 1st to September 30th. So we carry over some of the grants because they may be a federal grant. Older American Act grants through the ADRC is a big one. We get direct funding from federal government for Older American Act. Doesn't fit in a nice calendar year budget, so there are carryovers. The other one, and you'll see some of those here, the other one is the state of Wisconsin. When you get a grant from the state of Wisconsin, its fiscal year starts on July 1st, goes through June 30th. So a lot of these grants for the health department are just a carryover of a budget from the old budget to the new budget. It's the same budget. It's the same grant, it's just carrying it over to continue the budget based on the fiscal year of the grantor, not us. So I just wanted to make you aware of that because as you think about the budget tonight, and it's an annual budget, and that's how we do things, we are always working within the other governments, their fiscal years, and so that's a carryover. Again, these are already budgets that were approved in the year that the budget was established. We're just carrying the money forward and continuing on with the projects that are in there within that budget for almost all of them, except I think $62. We had one for $62 in here.
For the rating info.
So this is finalizing a budget. This one would go because it's an increase in revenues of $62. Otherwise, they're all just carrying over and managing the continuation of a grant that they had. It's just the actual amount that they finally did receive in that grant. And the last one that I wanted to go through all the rest of the carryovers of the health, except for the very last one, which is a sheriff's department grant. Brand new grant that they received is public safety state grant. And it's for hardware and software, and it's for a license plate recognition grant. So that's a brand new grant, and those will be going next month in September, or December, I'm sorry, December to county board, because we're already got our November stuff, but we wanted to get these up to you. So that would be going to the county board in December as a budget resolution. So a little more of an explanation I usually give, but that's just because we kind of want to tie it into what you guys are doing tonight and how do these budget transfers occur and why are they this way? Because I thought it was maybe a little bit of a segue into what we're doing tonight and how it relates to the other ways we get money or why you're carrying it over, why isn't it in the grant? Because the grant was already approved in a previous year. We're just carrying over the money to continue the project or the program based on the fiscal year of the person that gave us the grant, which is either state or federal government. So
on the last one, the license plate recognition grant, if that's a new grant, does that require not only the intergovernmental department or intergovernmental transfer, but also an acceptance of the grant, if it's a first-time grant?
The way that these budgets are done is that we've answered all questions to make it that. So it was my impression that if you're making the approval here, it gives you all the descriptions of it. So I'm assuming if you approve it as a resolution, they have the grant. There's no
So
other.
in light of the county board rules, should the motion then be inclusive of both the transfer and the acceptance of the grant, particularly in the case of the last one?
That would be something for, I guess,
First
council
time grant.
administration. This is how we've done all new grants, and this is kind of how we've evolved this form into a way that will give you all the information that would be needed in order to understand that grant, because all the questions that were asked in the past in it are on page 2.
That's the mechanism by which we present it to this group, is the issue acceptance.
Well, I think, Mr. Chairman, if I might, I think when you answer, when you accept the budget transfer and the question on page 2 of the
Yeah.
budget transfer, is this a new program? And if that's checked yes, I think we're accepting the fact that it's a new grant, and we're accepting it by approving the budget transfer and accepting it that way. That would be my take on it, but I refer to attorneys to answer that question. But that would be my take on it. Because it also goes on to set up an initial
Right.
budget for the new grant, and so that box is checked. And then it says that this grant, no local match requirement, so.
I just like to practice law without a license, so I just.
Yeah, like I said, I don't think that there will be, but again, I would have to defer to court counsel for his discretion.
I don't know if Dan has anything, but this is Administrator Leonard. I know that we've had, within the health department, one of their, I hesitate to say standard practices, but one of their practices has been to complete a grant worksheet when accepting a new grant and prior to accepting a new grant. However, I think as Christie indicated, that we put these budget transfer documents and forms in place, working with our auditors to make sure that all appropriate information is within the forms as they will be adopted by this body and the board. So with respect to the license plate grant transfer, it does have, by virtue of your acceptance and through the request itself, a revenue increase, which is the new grant coming in, to be used for and to be transferred to cover the expenditures referenced within the same document. So I think my belief is, from a reporting standpoint, we're checking all of those boxes as required by our auditor. But if there's a specific request from the committee to develop some different process, we're certainly open to that.
Well, my concern is not the auditor, the concern is the county board rule that requires acceptance of the new grants, and if we're, we may appease the auditors, but we may be violating our rules. So I just looking for clarity, given the fact that we just did this with the Health Department and those 3 grants that they received for the COVID.
This form that we have in place was created and changed many times in order to meet the requirements of grant approval. So that's, if you need something else, that's,
No, I
Fine,
don't
but-
have any problem with the form.
Yeah.
The question is, what's the form of the motion, the language of the motion? So is it approval of the intergovernmental transfers and acceptance of the grants?
If I may, Mr. Chair, your board rules specifically within chapter 2, and the rule relating to the HR Finance and Property Committee does read that you are to review and approve for submission all grant requests which directly affect the finances of the county. So in terms of the form of your motion, I think utilizing that language would make sense.
See, I'm not seeking a change in the rule, or in the form. I just want to make sure that we comply with our rules. So with that, Kurt?
Let's talk about that, though. I think what the intent, and so, because rules review is being, I think we need some clarity on this. I think the initial real intent of that rule was this, that before a department goes out and applies for $1 million grant that's going to require $1 million match on the county side, that be approved by a standing committee. That's my read on it. It clearly isn't, so is that what we want, or do we want it after the fact? I think after the fact is a little bit different, because the paperwork's already been signed, the cash is already in the bank. It's a little late now to turn it down and say we're not going to accept it. So I think, because we're playing semantics now, to be honest with you, approving the grant now and then approving the interdepartmental transfer. In other words, the money's already here in the bank. So my question becomes, do we want clarity on the rule to say, do we want to have, because I'm signing grant documents all the time, and I'm not sitting there saying, did I get, committee approval to apply for this grant? And I don't think we're asking. So I guess I think we need to discuss that and make clear what we want in our rules and what we want in practice. Does that make the question?
I don't disagree with you, but this chair's interpretation of the rule says that we need to accept it and approve it. So
I get that, and I'm willing to I'll make the motion that we approve the interdepartmental transfers and accept the grant for the Sheriff's Department license plate recognition software, or license plate recognition grant.
So there's a motion on the floor. The motion is all-inclusive relative to the transfers and then specific to the grant. Is there a second?
Fisher in a second.
Any discussion? If not, all is in favor will signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, no. That motion carries. And Craig, you want to add that to the list for clarification for the rules review? But I think if you got a rule, we should clarify it.
Right, I think, if is it, so I guess I would provide some feedback for the committee from the HR Finance Committee. Do we want, I know because it's pertinent to this grant, I don't know if we got a little leeway to discuss it, but I think providing some feedback, do we want those grants to be approved by a standing committee prior to or after the fact? And that's my suggestion is, it doesn't make any sense to prior to application, maybe prior to approval, or prior to acceptance, but we need some clarity there.
I don't disagree. Any other thoughts? We'll kick that to Jennifer.
Help me understand. So when there is a grant, it's money given. If we as a board need to match, that's where, I mean, as the finance committee, we need to put out a match. And this particular one, there's no match from us. It's a grant, so it's given, correct?
But there may be, just for clarity, there may be expectations beyond dollar commitments, which is one of the reasons why you want review. It may require significant investment of staff time without necessarily a dollar for dollar match.
Okay,
I
thank
think
you.
That's why the review process was created.
Okay,
So
thank
we
you.
don't create, you create resources, we allocate resources between human resources and finance. And sometimes there's free money that is not so free because it requires significant compliance and other things. And I think that's the intent, is to make sure we're looking at what sort of commitments do we make beyond just a dollar for dollar match.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, we will move on to the American Rescue Plan, ARPA process. Criteria and timeline, we had in the minute.
John, did we approve this grant we just talked about?
Yes,
Oh, there's no changes.
we approved the intergovernmental transfers and accepted the grant.
Okay, all right, thank you.
So can I just ask, in light of what happened last Friday, Kurt, I've been trying to figure out if there were changes relative to the dollars, because we kept hearing that there was a potential for relief on certain things. Do you know from NACO, and I was only I could only participate in part of the WCA conference. Were there modifications relative to eligibility criteria in that bill?
There is anticipation, and I guess I would leave it at that at this point. There's anticipation that there may be clarification from Treasury, but at this point, there has been no clear modifications, no clear, it's understood that the $1.1 trillion infrastructure bill, classic hard infrastructure bill as some people want to describe it, was approved by the House and the Senate, going to the President's desk. And what does that mean for for the state of Wisconsin and ultimately Maryland County? State of Wisconsin is roughly 1.7 to 2.75% of the total nation. And so it's anticipated that we will get roughly $1 billion, a little better, of additional funding to the state. $500 million will come to the counties over the period of 5 years. And so, but has there been anything as far as clarification on ARPA and the 4 buckets that utilization? No, nothing as of yet, but there's anticipation that there may be.
So we're still waiting, not the interim final rule, but the interim final rule, or the final rule from the Treasury.
Correct. And I think maybe just a little bit of additional clarity, or a little additional information, maybe clarity, maybe a little more unclear, is that the human infrastructure bill now is the next major legislation, and that has got some additional additional potentials of having impact on ARPA. But where that sits, it's not known. The thought was, or the discussion that I've heard is, the hope is that they will have some kind of definitive outcome on it by Thanksgiving, but we don't know that for sure. Because that's anywhere from 1.5 trillion all the way up to 3 point some trillion. With the elections that took place last Tuesday and the change of one district, from what I understand is the president and the parties are hoping to have a vote by Thanksgiving on that infrastructure bill. But the margins are, there is no room for defection on any side, because the margins from a political standpoint is razor thin.
So for today, we have before us sort of if you look at the October 26th minutes, we got into what we're looking at. I don't think we've done a lot since the last meeting in context of where we're going, but are you comfortable with what we laid out and you approved in the minutes as sort of the process going forward? And actually, if you looked at the information, not in our packet, but for the packet for the county board tonight, associated with the resolution that we're going to take up later, there were the categories and sort of the buckets with subsets for each of those areas.
The one bucket with the 11 items?
It is like yeah.
You're just putting into buckets.
Yep.
But we're just creating the buckets.
Right.
We're not actually putting anything in the buckets.
No.
And those categories are very
Broad.
specific.
Well, the items that we've identified in the buckets are very specific, but the buckets themselves are still fairly general. So,
This attachment was sent to you in a previous time, but the buckets that you are looking at are going to be the public health, economic disadvantage, premium pay, revenue loss, and administrative expense. The items under it is really when the person said, you're going to say, okay, I need $5 million in public health. That's the bucket that we're going to be working with. When you apply through the standardized form, that's when the person needs to say, okay, it falls under public health. The person making the request is going to say, for a good example, maybe it's going to be the North Central Healthcare. I want to make it a request of funding of public health, item 1.10. So the intention isn't for the committee at this time to fill out every single one of these smaller items. It's the generalized buckets in blue that we're going to be establishing as funding. With those in place, then the person that's making the request, and the healthcare center would be a perfect example, they would say, okay, I have a $500,000 request under public health, specifically item 1.10, and it has an asterisk, which means it needs to have evidence-based reason for doing it, and then they would cite the evidence that would be the reason why this project would go forward. So the buckets really visualizing it is going to be the blue item, the reporting out, which is what we are going to do to the Treasury, is really where the smaller items come in place, not in the funding of it, but in the reporting back to the Treasury on what we did.
So what you've done in this list is you've taken 2 and 3 and combined them with the negative economic impacts and services to disproportionately impacted communities, so.
Right.
Those are the buckets with the feds. I think we should try to stick with them because that's where our reporting will go.
And we can, that didn't come up in the conversation, and I would appreciate it if we did, because then it matches directly into the reporting to the Treasury.
So are people comfortable with those buckets? And I think you can be creative in how we place things in there. I'm seeing heads nodding. Any thoughts for those remote? Jonathan, Craig, E?
No, I think that is a reasonable way to approach it, and I'd like to stick with that method. I think that's a good way to do it.
And then we're still looking for that clarification on where those go from that was sort of the discussion of where Treasury is. And then so if we agree to the buckets, we created a number of buckets, Sarah and I, after the public hearings. We can try to fit those categories into these buckets moving forward. So you've got an opportunity to look at how those would roll in. I don't think that would be that difficult. And then we can look at how we would then begin to do the criteria. And the question is, the criteria that we began the discussion is, do we have a separate criteria internally versus externally for those projects? When we're looking at them, and are there threshold criteria that they need to meet in order to be considered? So, any thoughts?
Supervisor Robinson, in regards to that, if you take a look at, and this isn't answering the full question, but we did have a conversation, scoring would be completed based on the expenditure category or funding bucket. So then that went to Supervisor Leahy's item of, is it a program or service, or is it a one-time funding? And so that's what we were trying to capture in the minutes here, talking about the scoring is based on the funding bucket, public health, and then within those, if it's a program such as, again, maybe the healthcare center has a program that we're going to participate in for mental health, it would be scored based on the program criteria. If it's a infrastructure project such as a broadband project, it's a one-time funding, and so it would go into the infrastructure bucket, and then the criteria would be different. So if that helps you memorialize the thought that you had right now, that was kind of the minutes reflecting what those conversations were from the last meeting.
Any thoughts? I think there's concurrence with that understanding. All right, we will then look at what the criteria will be in those buckets, but I don't know that we need to do that today. We can look at what's there and then come back at our next meeting and try to finalize that. I think we're still looking at, just as a side note, where are we relative to the lost revenue calculations? I think we're still struggling with how North Central Healthcare fits in.
The calculation for lost revenue for 2020 for the county has been completed. We've done the work in the finance department. It has been reviewed by our auditor to make sure that it tied directly out to our financial statements, audit financial statements, and our state report form. They had given suggestions that are very helpful, that we made sure that we tied it out to the single audit for federal revenues, and that we eliminated the bond premium discounts that are not eligible for being calculated. The healthcare center did provide us their revenue streams for 2019 and 2020 for the nursing home, and we were able to make a calculation on lost revenue for the nursing home portion. I do not have information because the healthcare center itself is a much more complex beast. I do not have revenue loss calculations for that portion at this time. But we do have them, very comfortable with those. The biggest item is whether or not the federal government will determine that the Mountain View Nursing Home is a standalone governmental entity, or whether it is going to include the full healthcare center as a governmental organization that we need to do a revenue loss calculation on. But we feel we have documentation at this time, at least to establish a nursing home as a Marathon County component unit.
Countywide, is this countywide or?
County 3.676687. NCHC is 3.183263 for 2020. So combined is almost 6.8 to almost 6.9. But that is without, so the 3.183 is the nursing home itself. It is not the other portion of NCHC, the 5142 portion. So that's the portion that is still waiting to be resolved. So we are effectively, again, 6.8, 6.9 million total loss. Unless Christie gave me wrong.
That's fine. Yep.
Those are the numbers that Christie provided.
So the question going forward is, if that's a lost revenue, is there a desire on the part of this committee to put some of that lost revenue in the buckets, or whether we want to keep that as a standalone source? The advantage of the lost revenue is that it removes many of the restrictions that are laid out in the ARPA funding. But again, the ARPA program was trying to bring relief to pandemic-related activities or expenses. So I think we need to figure out where we're going long-term with those. But that's good to have, and that's for, so that would be calculated for fiscal,
2020.
for 2020, so we would have 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023,
Those
and,
4 years.
okay.
Those are the 4 years that you can calculate the loss in lives. So,
Based on those assumptions, or that calculation, we could be in excess of our entire allocation, or close. At 25.3 million, if we're running 6.8, just on, ish. And, the calculation is based upon 4.1 growth in revenues, less, factoring in a number of factors, not all of our revenue. Bert?
well, Mr. Chair, obviously the loss revenue has to be calculated each year, and it's a separate calculation. Right now, we are at $6,859,950. That is a hard number for 2020. If you were to take that number and so there's a lot of ifs in it. And that is if you were to take that number and multiply that times 4, and assume that the 4 years lost revenue is equal for each of the subsequent years, 2021, 22, and 23. The full amount of our ARPA allocation, 26.3 million, would qualify under the lost revenue. And so there would be, effectively, that would allow you to utilize it for literally anything that the county is allowed to do, from a governmental standpoint. And, would give the county the most flexibility. That is not to say that you can't still utilize it in anything that is the buckets. However, if you put it all in lost revenue, you still could effectively utilize it in those other buckets without string attached. So, in my estimation, if you're going to be cutting something very close as to whether or not it qualifies under a bucket, you would be better off to utilize it under the lost revenue if it's a permitted expense for the county, or a permitted expense for the county to undertake. And therefore is not subject, potentially, because unless the lost revenue calculation is enacted, it would not be as subject to audit, review, and recapture by the feds.
But I agree with everything you've said. The problem is forecasting the future and whether or not we'll continue to have the lost revenue numbers that we currently have, so.
And the other part of this calculation is the NCHC loss portion, which is going to add to that loss already. Being the chair of the NCHC board and knowing the financial result of last year, that definitely is going to change, it's going to increase. So I am confident that at some point, that number of 6.859 is going to get greater, at minimum by at least another 1, maybe 2 million for the 2020 calculation alone. And with and then throw on top of that the fact that they're using a 4.1% increase and our levy limit. Now, we will have a bump in our revenue because of the one-time adjustment that will impact the net lost revenue next year by some portion, depending on what that 700 some thousand is as a percentage of the total in comparison to the 4.1. Does that make sense? Did I lose everybody?
It makes sense.
So in essence, next year's loss is not going to be at the county going to be 3.676. The county's is going to be much less because of the one-time adjustment.
And sales tax and other things that may flow in as well, so. It may, yes, so we have to, all those things are the variables that we don't control. We project, but we don't control. So I think for trying to move this on, I think what we need to begin to do is perhaps get a little bit more, let's get that lost revenue we can, for purposes of planning, if we could use that 6.8 because it's a known number versus unknown, and you can move things in, but we need to begin to figure out how we're going to begin to allocate dollars and whether we're going to allocate everything now or do it in tranches, with half of it versus all of it, and how we might proceed with trying to figure out how to spend those dollars. So before you do, you're looking, I'm sensing a look of confusion.
No, it's my normal face.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure.
I need to wear a
that before
mask so nobody can see it. No, I'm fine.
Okay.
I'm just trying to follow, and I'm like a step behind understanding, so maybe I am confused.
I just want to make sure we all are
No,
advancing.
everything that Kurt said makes total sense.
Okay. All right, Kurt, go ahead.
I guess the other thing is we're so close to December 2021 where we will be able to calculate 2021 loss revenue. And we have not finalized. You're absolutely right. I think that we could put 6.859 million into the loss revenue bucket and be 100% safe. I think in January or probably more realistically February or March, we'll be able to calculate the 2021 loss. And then we'll be able to put the additional loss if we want to. We want to wait that long, to put additional money into the loss because it gives us the most flexibility. Loss revenue.
Any questions from the committee? I think we're still, this is evolving. Maybe what we should do, because we've got the meeting on the 23rd, and we've kind of said we're going to set those aside for the ARPA discussion. Let's, get things on the table and bring back and have that a little bit more discussion at that meeting on the 23rd.
If you and I sit down and figure out.
Yeah.
The other item, listening to this conversation, the other item that is in the minutes, and Supervisor Gibbs brought up, is that you have the infrastructure bill coming. You may have a human capital bill coming. And therefore, you had made that very clear in the other meeting that as other things evolve, you may then change the funding in your buckets because you're going to maybe have more infrastructure money, or you may have more program money. So I just want to make you aware that as we go, please always remember that this is going to be a moving target just due to the fact that we know that other packages may be coming directly from the federal government as well. And that's reflected here, but I just wanted to make everybody aware that you were very mindful of that in that meeting last month.
Well, and there are so many things beyond our control. The governor this morning announced the next round of PSC grants. There's 100 million of the $129 million allocated for the biennium is going to be available. The grant process will begin December 1. And last round, we had $38 million worth of applications for Marathon County, and we got $150,000 of funding for the one project. So there are some opportunities for us to potentially leverage the ARPA dollars to get better success in some of our hard-to-serve areas, and there are some unique thoughts out there with whether we give grants or loans with those dollars to get them paid back over a period of time. So we'll have to make some decisions relatively soon for that round of grant applications and before we commit the county's resources. But I think we'll have some time going into, we'll have some time, not a lot of time to do that. But those are where forces beyond the control of the county may drive decisions. So we can talk about that at our next meeting as well. And again, we're looking to minimize the county's financial involvement by leveraging other sources of funding to expand those services. So we'll between now and that meeting, we'll talk with, try to take that information that Sarah pulled together, look at how those might fit into it. We'll get a better feeling of where we are with lost revenues, and what sort of flexibility we have, and then we'll begin to look at what sort of criteria we might want to have internal to those buckets. And I think once we begin to see the nature of the projects that we put in each of the buckets, it will be easier potentially to develop that criteria specific to that bucket. And then you'll be able to make some decisions. So we'll try to do that and get it out in advance of the meeting so you have a chance to think about it, if that makes sense. Kurt, are you, Allison? That makes sense. Jonathan, Craig, Yi?
Yes.
Yep, I'm good with that.
All right, Kurt?
I think the other thing, we obviously know that with the infrastructure bill being passed and signed, the additional resources available for broadband from the federal side. Not only are we going to have a $100 million grant cycle starting in December 1 of the Wisconsin Public Service, Public Service Commission, we're going to have potential opportunities, and I think the final design from Bud Cussel will be very close to in place by December 1. So now it becomes, because they want to have at least the discussions that I had with Steve last week, was that they want to have all of the fiber in the ground, and in fact, most of the towers up by December of next year. We should be able to identify some of those challenged areas in the county and look for partners that are willing to come forward to try to address some of those areas to hopefully improve the chances of broadband success on grants for those areas. Not only the PSC grant starting in December, but also the federal ones moving forward.
Well, the infrastructure bill had $65 billion for broadband, but it deals with access and affordability, so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, and that's over a 5-year period, so.
Devil's always in the details.
Yeah, so we'll need a better understanding of what that means and what it looks like, and we continue to try to push for a better understanding of how the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund dollars will work and play out, particularly with LTD and western part of the county. So we need to pay attention to those other factors. But the state is front-end loading this year,
The balance.
taking 100 of the 129 million, so they're trying to accelerate it, so he who hesitates is last.
Well, and I think there's going to be challenges by putting as much money that is being put out there, is there going to be capacity to put that much fiber in the ground, grant, and is there going to be supply chain issues, so it'll be interesting to see. Although, the last grant cycle, there was requests for, well, what, in excess of
428?
in excess of, or 300, so 328 million in excess of grant availability, so.
They awarded 100.
Even if the remainder of those 328 million grants just get reapplied, we're still not going to get enough dollars to go around.
So more to come, but we'll have, maybe we can talk afterward about how we prep for that meeting and move ahead. So that takes us on to anything else under the funding eligibility expense categories, criteria, timelines. I think we've talked about that. The next would be the funding to purchase a web-based application for tracking ARPA funding to educate, identify, prioritize, and communicate the county's strategic ARPA funding plan. So there's a resolution in the packet. And
I just want to mention that this resolution is twofold. One, we're going to talk a little bit about Arpa Action. It's a web-based application that we would use to help communicate the funding strategic ARPA funding strategy. But secondly, from our process that we have right now, any ARPA funding request would go to the county board. And so this very long, detailed resolution is kind of the first attempt at how do you guys want a ARPA funding resolution to look like? So any comment, it's very long because it's try to add everything you might need in it, but also at the same time, any comments or constructive criticism on how we should structure a ARPA request to the county board. That's the second actual request that we have, is to, we want to make sure that we've got it to encapsulate everything we need to, but it also probably doesn't need to be quite as long as it is. So there's two things that I'm requesting is one, take a look at it for the request to fund the web-based application, but secondly, we're going to be fine-tuning the resolution so that when they do go to county board, that it meets all of your needs as well.
It's on the board agenda for this evening. Yeah, go ahead, Lance.
Thank you, Chair Robinson. And please, as Christie indicated, first, provide feedback to our team about putting together that future resolutions as to what you believe you would like to see in there. We'll have legal do the same in terms of those reviews. In terms of timing, it is on the county board agenda as it's on your agenda today. Please do not feel rushed to take action on this today. We put in the previous board, in the previous committee agenda, a link to a short recorded video showing how that system worked. In light of your conversation at your last meeting and your conversation today about allocating funds to buckets, I might suggest that I sit down with Chair Robinson and get our representatives from Baker Tilly on a WebEx, which I just did yesterday, and have them walk through what that program really does. And then essentially the chair can report back whether or not he believes it's valuable. It would be valuable to the rest of this committee in terms of giving you a tool to allocate those funds available to those various buckets, because that in essence is the true essence of the tool. It's not some robust accounting tool. It will be helpful in a couple of areas, but the greatest the greatest in terms of asset of the tool is its ability to allow elected leadership to take time, consider each of the eligible expense categories, and then allocate a portion of the funds that are available to those various categories. So I'd be happy to do that, Mr. Chair, if you'd like to do that. And you don't need to take action today again.
You know, we had a discussion earlier this afternoon about, you know, where to go with this, and I think the question is what are the expectations of this committee? What will the expectations of the county board be? And what will be the expectations of the public as to whatever system we have in place in terms of their ability to look at it from a transparency perspective and know where we are. And I think we just need to take that step back and make sure that we're looking at it from different lenses. And I don't think it's ready for that prime time, if you will, at this time. Kurt?
Yeah, I would agree. I think, I took a look at what the link that we had, but I didn't go into any great detail. But I think you sitting down with the administration and our auditors, going through and evaluating the value of the tool, again, from the discussion I've had with the administrator on his understanding of the program, it allows us, the committee, to utilize it to assist us in allocating dollars into those buckets and providing that information effectively to the full board. My thought is, because where we're at right now, the funds for ARPA are all in a separate account, and it does require a budget transfer to move those out, would be that we would provide to the full board, after we've had the time, had potentially the use of the tool to allocate to those buckets, what you or this committee feels is appropriate in each of those appropriate buckets, and then would take that budget transfer to the full board for its discussion, if that's appropriate. And then those dollars would be allocated in those buckets. That's not to say that they can't be changed, depending on the demand and or need as the projects come in that we review. That we can always do another budget transfer from bucket 1 to bucket 2 at a future point by the board if the demand for projects under something comes in other than, for example, under health. We get more under infrastructure, more broadband expansion or something. I'm just using that as an example. We can always make those transfers in the future, but I think reviewing the viability and usefulness of that tool by you and the administration, if I can take a look at it with my current background, I think it might be helpful. But I would only offer that as appropriate.
And I'm going to look for another volunteer on the committee that, to look at it from the perspective of the public and others, if we could bring that perspective in. And what do we need? I think at the end of the day, we need to understand how this tool will help us and what the public's expectations will be. And if we can't buy it through this or get it through this, then we'll need to look at how do we set it up. But I think it's important that we have that understanding early in the process. So, no offense to Jonathan. Jonathan, you got too much of a financial mind. I'm looking for another volunteer, and that's good in most cases. But any volunteers to help?
Yeah, I'll feed him really quickly.
All right, we have a process, and perhaps talk to the rest of you as we're moving this on. But we'll try to bring all of that into the next meeting for a discussion, so we'll be in a position to move forward. Anything else on that issue? If not, we will move on to discussion and possible action in the committee to forward to the county board for its consideration. Discussion and possible action review of proposed amendments to the 2022 budget received from county board supervisors. Let me just say that they compliment the administrator on having the perfect budget because nobody has come forward with any proposed amendments. Therefore, we have none to consider and move on to the county board. And I think it really, the comments that I've heard from the supervisors is one of appreciation to the detail and the context of the budget and the narrative that help them understand programs better than they have in the past. And I've heard that in particular from first-term supervisors, one who's here, and Supervisor Dickinson was also very complimentary to the process. And I think that there's a lot of information that we've historically not had that puts things in perspective, which helps with understanding and avoids confusion. So thank you to the administration and to the administrator for a job very well done.
Thank you, and I would just say all the credit goes to Christy and the team on the finance side. Sarah did an excellent job with working with all of the departments. I mean, they really did the work. I just made the presentation. But thank you, and if you do have constructive comments as well, happy to hear those.
We will move on then to the establishing salaries for the county board supervisors for the 2022 and 2023 term. We have a resolution in your packet calling for a 3% increase, consistent with what we've given to our employees and pursuant to the rule. Anything you'd like to add?
Sure. If I may, I had a conversation with Board Chair Gibbs and Molly Adzik from Human Resources. I believe we would be asking for one amendment, and Kurt can correct me if I get the date wrong. But in terms of the date referenced for the pay increase in 2023, given the timing of the various pay periods for the county, we're asking that the effective date listed be both in the third whereas as well as in the now therefore section, indicate January 9 of 2023, which is the first date of that pay period in 2023.
Any discussion? Kurt?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple of things. One of the things that, in looking at the board chair, vice chair, and standing committee chair salaries, one, if you're going to raise the chair salary by 3% on his total salary, I think that's only appropriate that the same be held true for the vice chair. That right now, technically, the 3% is not being applied to the 3,500 additional salary that is paid to the vice chair. He or she or they, the vice chair, is only receiving the increase that is equal for every board member. The one in the effective 4/19/2022, that increase would be 165. I've calculated if you utilized the 3% on the current salary, 89.91, it would be increasing at 270. So you would be increasing it a little bit more, but I think that, to me, makes sense rather than only increasing it just the 165. And then I would really like to have a discussion by this committee about the extra salary that is paid to standing committees. We ask a lot of the standing committee chairs, and they are responsible for the agendas of all of the standing committees they're responsible for a lot more work. Now, I do know that we would have to make some kind of adjustment if we did raise that salary, and may be able to take it out of effectively out of transportation, because we didn't change that transportation portion in the budget this year. We're still going to have a lot of people not coming into meetings 100% in January.
It's transportation for county board members.
County board members internal of the, so there, I think we could make some adjustments, and it would affect the county board's allocation in the budget. It'd just be internal. But I would like to have a discussion about whether or not that $600 is appropriate, or we should raise that $600 for standing committee chairs. And I think that there should be a discussion about whether the vice chair should receive that 3% on his total salary and increase for a vice chair salary.
So any other questions, comments from members?
Supervisor Fisher here.
Go ahead, Jonathan.
So just to piggyback on that, to make sure I have an understanding, that assumption would effectively mean that, for instance, in the vice chair, the $3,500 is really actually in the base salary of that position, rather than saying a regular standing full board member plus $3,500. The $3,500 would actually be baked in with the $5,000-ish, and then the 3% would be applied to that total rather than independently. Is that correct? Just so I caught all of that.
That's what I was proposing, and I'm not willing to make that motion at this point. I wanted to hear feedback from the committee. But if you're going to apply the 3% as you have to the chair salary, 30,900 in comparison to 30,000, I think the 3% should be applied to the full vice chair salary, which is the regular board member's salary plus the 3,500, and then multiply that times the 3% instead of effectively just the 3% on the base salary.
Okay, just wanted to make, and that's understandable. I just wanted to make sure I followed the whole analysis there, and so thank you for just kind of rehashing that.
So this is a two-step process. The first step is to create the budgetary authority, and the second step would be to modify the rule of the board. So, as I understand it, because we're setting those salaries in the rule, is that correct?
Mike, you'll have to look, it's Rule 19, and the way your current rule is structured is that the chair of the board has a single sum in terms of their salary. The vice chair, as well as the chairs of standing committees, and all county board members likewise receive a base salary, but they have a $3,500 addition under sub 19B for the vice chair. Chairs of standing committees have the $600 addition. So I think you have a couple different ways to accomplish whatever end you choose.
I would agree with the administrator. And to answer your question, Chair Robinson, the rule as currently constructed, Rule 19, sub B, describes the vice chair as receiving that $3,500 in additional annual compensation. So if we were to change that, it would in effect be changing Rule 19, which would be a separate action from the budgetary impact of changing the salaries themselves.
So that does not have to be done before papers are taken out, does it? Nomination papers?
Amendment of the rule itself?
Right. We have to set the salaries for the supervisors prior to December 1st. We don't have to set the salaries for its officers. Is that?
I think we do. I think the same rule would apply because the officers would also need to have the understanding, well, if I was elected and I was elected chair or vice chair, this is what the salary would be.
Go ahead.
So the question I have, I guess, for Corp Counsel, does that mean that if we chose to do something other than what is presented in front of us, which is actually the application of the board rules, do we need to, and we chose to go to something different, would we need to suspend the rules and do we need a 2/3 majority of the board to actually pass the resolution?
Well,
I'm sorry.
no, that's a good
I think
question.
it's a valid question.
While they're just conferring, any other questions or comments?
Sorry.
But I think it's appropriate. Yeah, if you want to join me, there are 3 legal minds working on it.
I guess I was looking for anybody else got any feedback as far as, Mr. Chairman, does anybody else have any feedback as to whether or not that would be appropriate? And the $600, or at least have a discussion about the $600 increase for standing committee chairs.
So when I first saw this resolution, my first response was, what about the vice chair? So this did come up at exec, and no decision was made at exec, when, executive committee, when they discussed it. I think it was something that I think everybody thought merited further discussion and evaluation, but no discussion or recommendations came out of that meeting.
Mr. Chairman, may I?
Go ahead.
So I just want to clarify this again. With those suggested increases, we would offset it by lowering or adjusting the mileage budget portion of it. So it wouldn't be really an increase. It would still be within the budgeted amount towards or allocation to the supervisors. Am I understanding this correct?
That is the intent.
As the county clerk holds in her budget the allocation for the county board's cost of expenditure, whether that be travel, whether that be salary, whether that be NACO travel, whether that be WCA travel or conferences, all of that is held within the clerk's budget. As I understand it, the clerk did not adjust the expense line inside the county board budget for travel, which reimburses supervisors to travel to meetings. So I'm confident that we would have enough additional money in travel inside the clerk's county board allocation if we chose to do something different with salaries, 2 chairs, vice chairs, and/or vice chairs of standing committees, within reason.
Supervisor Lake.
So does that mean this is a one-time?
Well, it would be for this year. Next year's budget would, obviously, there may be a difference in next year's budget, and if we throw that on the administrator to fix that.
Perfect.
Follow me, in other words, we're still doing it, we're still doing it within the budgeted allocation for the county board for 2022. 2023 may be a different because we may be back to full travel and full in-person meetings, but that's yet to be seen. Does that make sense?
I double checked that you are correct. The travel and the mileage was the same as 2020 to 2021 to 2022, and it all resides within the county clerk's budget under county board, and therefore this change would not change your total amount of budgeted funds in 2022. I'm sorry, 2022.
So any thoughts?
John, this is Craig.
Go ahead, Craig.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not going to speak to the vice chair salary, but to the chair of the standing committees, I do believe that should be increased. The 6 years, I believe, that I was chair of public safety, there is a lot more responsibilities from when I started till the end, as far as commitments from those chairs of those standing committees. A dollar amount I don't have, but I believe the $600 and that was increased. And like I said, the dollar amount, I had $1,000 additional, which would be $400 a year more. So on 2 years it would be $800. But that's just my thoughts. Thank you.
Kirk?
One addition, and then I'll let the rest of the committee weigh in on it. I know that the $600 stipend that was added to the standing committee chair's base salary, if you will, has been $600 for at least more than 8 years. It has not changed. And it may even be much longer than that. I don't even know when it because I've been vice chair or chair at the end of this term, will be 10 years. And it has not been different since then. So, and yet we're asking more and more of each of those. And in fact, involved, as you clearly point out, Mr. Chairman, are asking more and more of our vice chairs of our standing committees. So maybe if you were to do something like 400 times 6 is $2,400, it's not going to break the bank. If you were to do $800 for the chair and $200 for the vice chair, it's recognizing something, and it's a step in the right direction. But I will now give out my discussion portion. Leave it up to the
Any thoughts? I know that Supervisor Leahy and I talk before every committee meeting, and she is a member of the executive committee, in addition to being here, which is a second standing committee, and the vice chairs are expected to participate in the executive committee. So there is additional.
Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead.
Yes, I have no objections to it, as long as obviously we're not increasing if it's no additional new money, I'm okay with it. I'm okay if we're able to make adjustments to accommodate for it. I'm all right with the increases as proposed by Chairman Gibbs.
All right. Kurt?
I just want to make one thing clear, though, and that is, granted, if this committee was to recommend that, I could support that. But I do want everybody to be clear that that $2,400 potentially is not, if we were back to full travel in 2023, which this resolution does cover, you potentially increasing the budget by $2,400 plus the 3% on the $2,400 for 2023. If we're back to full travel and full in-person meetings, and we're not, and we're using up the travel allocation, we don't have that available, so the administrator would have to put an additional $2,400 potentially in the 2023 budget at that time.
Supervisor Fisher here.
Go ahead.
I also agree with the current plan. I think that the chairs and the vice chairs do carry a heavy burden and would be comfortable as long as that's, again, same thing, has that cost offset. And I do believe, unless we have a rule change forcing all members back, the utilization of the WebEx services, especially at least at the committee level, has been pretty successful over this term. And I think will probably be utilized into the next several terms. I'm just speaking the fact that I work from home permanently, so this is kind of my life, and successful at it at all times. So I think we may have that ability to move those funds kind of on a more permanent basis. Obviously, I would see some members traveling more often into the future, but I think it will be tempered with those individuals utilizing the web services as well.
So what I'm hearing is that there's a desire to have the 3% increase for the base county board rate, member rate, 3% for the chair, 3% for the vice chair, and $200 increase for the chairs and vice chairs of each of the standing committees. Is that the consensus that is evolving? And if it is, we need a motion to do that. And then do we need to modify the rules or as part of this?
So, interestingly enough, anytime we're adopting or altering county board salaries, that requires 2/3 majority vote of the board. Also, 2/3 majority is required for amending the rules. So, my answer would be, as long as you are having a 2/3 majority vote of the board making the amendment that you're requesting, you're going to be covered because you're authorized to both amend the rule with that supermajority and to fix salaries at whatever amount.
All right, so we have an interpretation from the Corporation Council that,
So the motion that we would request from the body would be a motion to approve the recommended salaries for the 2022-2023 term, which includes suspending the current rule.
I think that would be fine.
Thank you.
so was that a motion?
Sure.
It's been moved by Chair Gibbs to have a 3% increase for the chair, vice chair, and board members, and a $200 increase for the committee chair, standing committee chairs, and vice chairs. And you recommend that to the board, and included in that resolution will be a suspension of the rules to accomplish said task.
I'll make the motion. This is Supervisor Zhang.
That would be a second. Supervisor Gibbs made the motion, so you are seconding it? Yee?
Sorry, it was gonna the second. Sorry
Okay.
about that.
So again, the motion is to increase by 3% per year, the salaries for the chair, vice chair, and board members. And a $200 increase for chairs and a $200 increase for vice chairs of standing committees. And that the resolution incorporate those changes as well as a suspension of the rules to accomplish that. Any? Additional, yes, an additional $200. You'd hate to unintentionally decrease the. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor will signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, no. That motion carries unanimously.
Mr. Chair,
Greg?
this is Craig. Yeah, thank you. Just to add a little bit to that discussion about the continuation of the virtual meetings. We are continuing, as you know, to discuss that at rules. And this Thursday, it's on the agenda again to see if there's any additional information we need or before we make a recommendation. Thank you.
For purposes of clarification, Chair Gibbs, I did hear you say effective January 9th, 2023 for the second year. Did-
You absolutely did. You just
And-
didn't repeat it, that's all.
Yee, did I understand that was your second as well?
Yes, that's correct.
And did I understand that everybody,
Voted to approve it?
was that, by consent, it was the effective date of 1/9/2000.
Let's just go through right here. Mr. Chairman, I'll make a motion to change the effective date on the resolution to be 1/9/23 in the now for be it resolved, and in the third whereas change to be 1/9/23 in resolution 80-20.
Do we have a second motion dealing with this issue? Is there a second to that Supervisor? Leahy?
Fisher to second.
Give- Motion by Gibbs, second by Leahy, third by Fisher, and any discussion? If not, all those in favor of that motion will signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, no. That motion carries. All right, anything else come before us?
If that's amended, do they have to approve the budget as?
All right, our next meeting will be the 23rd at 4. We will have again our continuing discussion on the ARPA process. We will look at the buckets, some of the processes, and look at that lost revenue calculation and try to get our arms around that. and look at the potential contracting for tracking of ARPA funds at that meeting. Anything else you'd like to see on that agenda as it relates to ARPA? If we have more clarification, we will, and perhaps one of the things we should talk about is the universe of the known federal changes, you know, as we look at, NACO's done a good job of breaking down the infrastructure bill, but it might be helpful if we all have a good understanding of how some of the pending or approved legislation might affect us. So a federal grant update, if we could put that on there as well. Because I think that's important for the context of our discussions here. Anything else? If not, a motion to adjourn is in order. Moved by Leahy, seconded by Arstead. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries. Thank you very much. Why don't I try to get my arms around that in the